And recorded.
Thank you very much, Phil. Hello, I would like to welcome everybody to our panel discussion today on using the art of Destreza in competition and tournament settings, a panel discussion. It is actually being sponsored by Terra School of Sword, which is run by Phil. Phil, do you want to say anything before we begin?
Yes, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. The reason why I decided to pull all these incredible talent together to do this was because I felt like we have a lot of tournaments coming up, and I felt like for a while Destreza and the SCA and all just Destreza groups period kind of slowed down in conversation. So I'd like to make sure that we're still here.
Thank you, Phil. And again, thank you for doing all the effort of organizing all of these presenters and the panelists to come together today, because again, it was a little bit more common early on in the pandemic, thanks to Puck and some of the LVD discussions that were occurring then. So it's a great opportunity for all of us to gather again. Just a couple of reminders as we start, I know some people are just coming in right now. If you are not a panelist, please mute yourself. And we are recording this right now as we speak. So if you do not wish to be on camera, please turn off your camera. And if you have questions, we will be taking them as we go on today. And we ask that you please type them into chat. And Phil will be getting those and passing them on to me or asking them himself of the panelists. So to start off, I'd like to, making sure we're going through the checklist of the beginning here. So my questions that I'm going to be asking today of our panel, before I start the introduction, is going to be very general. I want them to have conversations, and I want them to have debates, and I want them to really dig into some of the material as good Destreza practitioners will get into. And it will probably lead to insults, as most good Destreza conversations, and nobody will take anything personally. So picturing Carranza's in San Lucar, where his book, his philosophy is written. And just like Carranza gathered all of his masters or practitioners or philosophers together in San Lucar by the seaside, he is brought them together to have this conversation that he started writing about this dialogue. So that's kind of how we're starting today. Who's Udemio, who's Philandro, Charalau, etc. All of these people from Carranza's book are represented on our panel today. I will not identify any of them, but I will identify our panelists themselves. We will start off with, and I'll read little brief introductions in order to make sure we can get as much conversation in as possible. We have Collin Vredenburg, and if I'm mispronouncing your name, Collin, did I mispronounce the name?
Yes and no.
Oh, I butchered that. Oh, you're being kind and smiling. Oh, okay. The camera totally revealed that.
It's okay. Dutch, so it's Vredenburg.
Say your name, Collin, so I don't. Not everybody's as easy to pronounce as Kozlowski. So
no, you're fine. My name is Dutch. It's weird. It's Vredenburg.
Vredenburg. Yeah. Collin Vredenburg is an instructor at the Metropolitan Historical Fencing Academy in Washington, who specializes in Tybalt's Academy of the Sword. Collin's a regular competitor at national tournaments and has earned medals in many rapier and side sword events using only the principles of Thibaut. I could go into his specific. He also has a popular TikTok at Real Thibaut. I'll do a nice quick plug for that. Next, we have Kaden Wang. Kaden, am I mispronouncing your name?
Oh, you're good.
Okay. Kaden started sport fencing in 2010 during college. In 2015, he decided to pursue historic fencing and joined the Sacramento Sword School. Expecting to learn Italian rapier, he was pleasantly surprised by La Verdadera Destreza and quickly fell in love with it. In 2017, he joined the Diamond Rose Academy of Arms to apply Destreza techniques against other rapier styles. With increased exposure to other systems and an introduction to Viedma's method of teaching masters, he started to develop his own method of applying Destreza theory. Traveled to fence in open tournaments and competitions and has medaled using Destreza. Next, we have Jim Lai. Jim has been studying rapier and fencing for more than 20 years and Destreza for more than 10, with a focus on Pacheco's use of the sword alone and Figueiredo's work on the sword with companion weapon like the dagger and cloak. The Society for Creative Anachronism considers him a master of defense, and he also holds a third-degree black belt from the World Taekwondo Federation. And we also have Lois Spangler, who started learning swordplay with Aido almost 20 years ago. After coming to Australia, she took up European historical fencing, focusing on Vredenburg Destreza around 2016. Surrounded by non-LVD rapier folks, she has plenty of opportunities to observe and practice Destreza against a wide variety of opponents, and hopes she can share some of the things she learned today. And we also have Puck Curtis, who began studying historical fencing in 1992 and researching Spanish swordplay in 1994. He's the co-founder of the Destreza Translation and Research Project and the primary author of From Pages to Practice, Fundamentals of Spanish Swordplay. Currently living in California, he's taught historical fencing for over 20 years with a specific focus on Spanish traditions. He tested and received his certification as a Master of Arms before a traditional board of fencing masters with the San Jose Fencing Masters program in 2008, and has expanded traditions by examining a number of instructors, provosts, and fencing masters. And as Puck mentioned before we started, his main focus has recently been on pedagogy and on certifying new instructors and really encouraging the growth of the style. I'm Doug Kozlowski. I'm an SCA fencer primarily, and Phil has been kind enough to bring me in to help MC this event. Did I miss anything from any of our panelists that you think is valid that needs to be said before we get on to the questions and we dive into them?
Let's do it.
Yep, I think we're good to go.
Okay. We got a number of questions, but as more are going to come in, so let's start off. I'm going to make it nice and general. Start off with the good one here. What should people expect when they compete with Destreza? There you go. That's the first question. Take that where you will, and we'll see where it goes.
So, I mean, one of the first things I've noticed when you use this Destreza in a tournament, in just sort of a mixed tournament, and the SCA is pretty good for this kind of Super Smash Brothers type of sword fighting, where you'll have any number of different styles and weapons and combinations of weapons, all just kind of lumped in together, and you just sort of see what happens. I think if I had to boil it down to a single sentence, people are going to lunge at you, and you need to figure that out.
I guess another thing is don't expect to use like a Tahoe to engage, because there's a lot of like sword refusal guards. Some people like fence guard forward, but it's still kind of refused. Like their tip is around like their chest height, but their arm is so far back. Like getting a good Ataho is pretty hard. So don't expect to use Atahos as like a first intent kind of entering thing. You have to really be good with your timing and your distance, and you got to rely a lot less on your blade work.
Excellent. We're diving into techniques already. So a Tahoe's useless is what you're saying, right, Kaden?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely.
Sorry, my job is to provoke discussion. I'm just saying, I'm reframing.
So,
just
all,
kidding. Continue. I'm sorry.
Not to put words in Caden's mouth, but that's not what he said. And secondly, what it means is he's absolutely right. You can't rely on just being able to go in and put an atajo on somebody from the start, usually. And one of the things that I've used to help me think through that is because if you guys don't know, I've got a Patreon. If you go to Patreon and look up Lois Spangler, you'll find my translations. I'm working on the abridged version of Carranza's seminal book, The Philosophy of Arms, as abridged by Pacheco, which is an adventure in itself. But one of the things that struck me is that, when you look up the word atajo, like you go to dictionary.com and you look up some general translation, it comes up as shortcut, but it also comes up as interruption. And if we think about the atajo as an interruption of the opponent's action, it means one of two things. One, if they're acting we can apply that atajo to the action that's occurring. But if they're not acting, then we have to do something else. And that leads us into the world of the acometimiento, or the LVD feint. And we'll tackle that later, because I know that's going to be a big discussion. But the atajo is always applicable as a technique, but always as a concept. You should be looking to troll your opponent's actions. It's sort of like, two kids in the back seat going, I'm not touching you, does this bother you, I'm not touching you. You're trying to achieve a similar thing, perhaps not overtly, but if you've got an opponent with a really withdrawn guard, you're going to have to do something to get them out of that guard. But once they get out of that guard, that weapon then comes into your proximity in a way that you're going to be able to take advantage of, and you can interrupt what they're doing and bring it into your territory. Have them start doing things that you understand and can manipulate. Now, that's all easier said than done, but that's the kind of thing that you can practice. Rada spends a whole chunk of his book teaching people how to fence Italian for the express purpose of then having students play Italian against diestros so that the diestros can learn what to do. So.
Well, okay, relating to that, then Lois, just in terms of, first of all, I love the description of backseat. I'm not touching you. I'm not touching you. I'm sorry. Best description of Destreza ever. But now somebody actually asked in there was saying, how do you close with them then? Somebody actually asked that in the chat just now, I spotted. And I know that Kaden mentioned that don't use it to engage, to close. And how do you close with somebody that doesn't want to close them?
So you don't, right? You don't, because from my perspective, Destreza is a very defensive martial art. So you really shouldn't be attacking them. And if you, on the flip side, like if you have to because it's a tournament, then you would basically try to use like invitations to get them to come to you, right? Because one thing that's really like the Pacheco Tahoe, like from above and all of that, like that's really good against a super deep, like high line committed attack. So if you can like bait that out of your opponent somehow with like a general or something to open yourself up, or convince them that you're opening yourself up and then they attack you, you can drop that nice deep Atajo and then glide flank basically, or thrust of quarter circle, I think it's called in the books.
So somebody in the chat asked, well, if they're not going to give you a point and you can't reach out to get it, why don't you just spend all your time in right angle guard? Are y'all ready for like some really crunchy Carranza theory on that?
It's one of my questions, getting into theory and philosophy, so go for it.
I mean, I can give you my personal experience, which is they stab you right here.
Right? Yeah. So the TLDR of what I'm about to tell you is you're basically giving them your weapon to manipulate at will. So unless you're putting your sword out there to keep them away with the knowledge that they're going to try to take it, and you have a library of responses to that, you have sort of a sense of how you can respond to that action, you're fine. But if not, you're just basically giving your sword for them to take. So from Carranza's perspective, you always need an inequality. There's all this Aristotelian physics, Here, the arm is at its center, right? So the center of the arm's rotation is the shoulder, but when we're talking about holding a guard, there's acute, there's right, and there's obtuse. So the acute is really weak because in order to do anything useful with it, you have to do a violent action. The obtuse is better because any action that comes from the obtuse is a natural action, but you're also leaving yourself wide open. So this right angle is really good, but you don't really have much strength to go anywhere from that right angle. You can go anywhere, but there's not a lot of strength because you need to bring it into Newtonian talk, you need potential energy to then give yourself kinetic energy. So here, if I'm in my center, I'm going to have to apply energy to myself to move somewhere else. But if I'm already out here, like if I'm, if I've got a nice inside atajo and they disengage, well, I've got already all this built up energy to move and change and take action. It's about not giving your opponent something to manipulate you with, and it's about making sure that you've got coiled up energy to apply when you need it, as long as you're properly covered with your sword. And
I
you're
want to,
just
yeah, I want to jump in here and maybe lay down some baseline ideas about getting into this fight, especially with somebody that's got a refuse guard. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
So we've got a fencer who isn't going to present the point, and there's a meta idea here is that without right angle, there's not going to be an Tahoe. So we just have to accept that. We know that there's a path forward that a right angle might come through. And then one of the other meta ideas is that the hand is going to be the origin of the sword and all the threats. So with those two things in mind, we can't place an Tahoe. Maybe we put the right angle on there, and the right angle seems like the right answer because in a world where we were filled with identical twins, with identical swords, my right angle should be their right angle. But I'm like 5 foot something, and that, and I carry a weapon appropriate for my size, and that right angle isn't going to solve all my problems because there are people out there who are a lot bigger than I am who carry a lot longer weapons. So now right angle is out the door. So I don't have a Tahoe. My right angle isn't going to do it. So then we look at, well, if the hand is the origin of the threat, I need to probably lower my point to stay proximate to their hilt. And we get into a range of solutions that can happen. So when Pacheco starts talking about two different techniques, there's like hilt thrusting, where they're pumping their hand back and forth to change lines, or the rising goring attack called the cornada. And then the attacks to the hand, he pulls out something called in the manner of weak under strong, where he lowers his tip to invite to the upper line. So he's making himself a little bit faster by reducing the open lines. The other answer that we hear a lot of is like a virtual atajo, where you place your hand out as if you were farming an atajo, and that atajo is going to intersect the line that the adversary is probably going to strike through. The problem with virtual atajo, in my opinion, is that because atajo is a bent arm posture, that suddenly it exposes the wrist. While if you point your weapon straight at the adversary's hilt, you get coverage in your arm that you wouldn't get with that bent arm position. So that bent arm position is going to expose your arm to attacks to the arm, while if you went into something like a weak under as an invitation, you're going to be in a much better position. And I know that Pacheco talks about weak under in two different situations. I know Kaden and I have both worked on weak under, and he and I have different answers. We argue about it. Has anybody else got any ideas about using weak under as an invitation?
I know Rada talks about it as well as using weak under as an invitation. But he also wants to use inferior atajos, which is atajos from below. So I mean, he's just weird, period.
Well, the
But yeah,
inferior Tahoes are just like renamed generals, right?
that's
So,
right.
Yeah,
That's right.
basically, yeah.
Can somebody's asking in the chat right now, can we
Define
define
weak
weak
under.
under? Ken just linked it as a matter of fact. Thank you very much, Ken. I appreciate that. Didn't know there's a quick description because I know people are jumping into the deep end here who might want to understand this. But if there's any, if anybody can toss out a quick definition of what you mean by weak under.
Placing your tip underneath the opponent's sword, placing your tip right here with some sort of circular motion at some point. Your tip hasn't passed their cooling yet, so technically it's not an atajo, except you're much quicker to disengage from here to hit the opponent. I know it's hard to see, but it's usually done on the inside wound, to wound on the inside usually.
Right.
Yeah, I'm going to say carrying your own weapon from the inside into a clockwise spiral so that your point is under their strong. And sometimes you're going to pick up their weapon and carry it like a transporting action where you carry them in a half circle clockwise. And sometimes you're just going to be putting your point underneath their hilt, from inside high to like inside low, clockwise.
outside high, inside.
Yeah, it's outside high to inside low if you're transporting, and if you're just moving your weapon in space, you're
Oh,
only,
I see. Yeah.
which is what we're talking about with the invitation, is we're just going to take our point and put it under their hilt on the inside line.
And my question is, how many people who have their cameras off now are going like this to the air to try to mimic exactly what you're saying? But yes,
Turn
I
all their
understand.
cameras on at once.
No, crash my camera. I can't do that. But thank you very much for that definition. So continue with the discussion. We're
Yeah,
talking
so
about techniques
we
and
got a question
transport.
from the chat. It
Please
says,
go for
so
it.
the concept is you're kind of flipping the sword up and out of the way, not necessarily, because you're starting with you're starting, you know, from the outside line, the high outside, and you're bringing it underneath. You're not like ideally, I think in my sort of perfect scenario, you do end up transporting. So the sword isn't going out of the way. The sword is just living right there in the in where your top can meets your hilt, and then they can just eat it because it's not going to go anywhere except wherever you want to put it. And yes, it absolutely changes if they're a lefty. You use a different general.
Yeah, so when Pacheco is setting this up, both blades are at liberty. So what he's doing is he's carrying his own blade in half circle clockwise to place it under the adversary's hilt. So there's no contact, which is sort of the situation we're describing. And then it forms an invitation to the high line. And then, but the nice thing about having your tip low and your hilt high with the inside high line exposed is that you can close that entire line all at once. So you're inviting inside high and you're going to close inside high. So when Pacheco describes it against the person who likes to attack to the hand, he creates that half circle. And in the tempo of that half circle, the person attempts to strike to the top of the arm, and then he collects it by continuing the circle, and he'll move up into a glide on the outside line in something like an Italian third. That would be like an invitation in first, glide in third, if you're used to Italian terminology. When he talks about it against the hilt thrust, it's just a straight up parry in weak under strong, which is much more Rada-esque in my opinion. But he just puts that point low and then he sort of jams. It looks like to me like he jams his sword in with a circle step to the right. And so he's using that slope to accept the force. It's not quite a hanging parry. And then he sidesteps and he'll deliver a parry reposting action. And then we also get, I think somebody posted this in the chat, from the same position, you can do a movement of diversion. So you lower that point with your hilt high, that thrust comes in, boom, and then you turn your hand like a hanging saber parry, which is movement of diversion, and then you've got options. My favorite option from there is to throw a cut. In the SCA, if you cut somebody on the back, on the top of the arm, that may be unfriendly, you should do it anyway. Just tell them I told you.
It's fine. It's fine.
For any Dutch Streza folks in the chat or around,
Things
in,
around
Tib-
here.
in Thibaut, we call this obliging the blade. We have a bunch of chapters on it, and in fact, he even shows specifically this as the primary way to engage against Italian forms. It's book 1, chapters 24 through 27, I think. But yeah, all the same.
Kaden, do you want to make the case for that? Because you're better at the weak under as a parry than I am. And it might be useful to talk about, like, the general technique of weak under strong is considered to be an attack, a compound attack, which carries the adversary's weapon in a half circular path and then boom, it detaches and goes. But here, like, all the authors also overload this as a parry. Kaden, maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Uh, I'm not sure what to say about it. I
Well,
use it a lot as a parry.
yeah.
And I use it also as a way. It also depends on like what kind of attack is coming your way. Like if someone's in like a low or refuse guard, and most of the time they're like in low guard, their thrust is rising right up, so it's basically a low line attack, and weak under is basically a low line parry. So it's great, yeah, to use weak under as a parry. And then even if they go like right under your arm, if you just bring your tip a little bit farther out to your outside, you can collect anything on the low line really. And then you basically go into like, yeah, a hanging, but with your fingernails up. And what that does is if you feel like, and you also have to like lift the tip to your face. So if you feel their sword leave, they're probably going to go for your right collateral or your flank. So you might want to parry and narrowing. But they could also, because your tip is low, they can push through your weak, and then you would have to like cross step back and then drop in a Tahoe outside in like a scooping motion. I'm not sure how to describe it. But you basically drop your hilt on top of their tip as you take like a mixed step to the right, so backwards and to the right. And then you profile behind that foot and you can riposte to their chest.
Yeah. I see it a lot when fighting Italian fencers who like to disengage, where you go for something like a Tahoe, and they immediately Cavacion and go to thrust, and you can pick it up. You can pick it up on the spiral, and just sort of move it out of the way because their sword is already in motion. You're just kind of helping it along, and then you stab them because their sword's like all the way over here now.
Here's just a question that just came from chat that I think is relevant to kind of bring it back to the tournament stuff, because we're really getting into the technique, which is wonderful. But Mariana asked, so going for the title of this panel, is there a particular Destreza action that non-Destreza people appear particularly incapable of dealing with or unable to stop at tournaments? And also, alternatively, are there any particular actions from Destreza that are punished or not worth going for based on tournament rules or how fencing is seen and understood for the refs? So I know that there's a lot in that, but just going back to the techniques, we'll go back to tournament formats because I actually have a couple of questions about that. But please, panelists, take that where you will. Anything that's punished or anything that people can't deal with? Oh, Collin looks so thrilled to answer this one.
Are we gonna count tournaments that don't allow cuts to the arm? Because I feel like if we allow tournaments that don't allow cuts to the arm, we're just gonna be like, okay, well that's gonna be punished.
What now?
So
I've been fencing a long time. I've never heard of
the
that.
Tournament, absolutely.
Yes, please don't do that. One thing that I've discovered as I've crossed over from doing more SCA fighting into more like kind of mixed HEMA tournaments is they really don't like when you grab their sword. HEMA judges hate blade grasping. Doesn't matter if it's like safe or whatever, they just don't like it. And so every time I go for my conclusion, people are like, dude, stop that. So you have to figure out a different way to apply your conclusions.
Is it against the rules there?
A lot of HEMA tournaments do not allow blade grasping or weapon grasping.
A lot of them do, and the crazy thing is, they will say that they will allow you to push.
Yes.
They won't allow you to grab. The crazy thing is, if you just push, a lot of times, and this is no disrespect to HEMA refs, I am one, and I'm mediocre at best. You can't tell the difference. You can't tell the difference. Not in like a quick action, you can't tell the difference. Right. So most of the time you'll go to push and your hand will be open and they'll call it a grab. I actually went to one tournament where I took my glove and I put my fingers in my glove like this so that I physically could not grab a sword, and I still got called for grabbing a sword.
Yep. So in the SCA, we allow grasping at the blade, but we don't want you to grab the hilt or the arm because you've started wrestling. HEMA tournaments are generally more okay with manipulating the arm or the hilt, but once you touch the blade, they're like, you're like, we're done. We got to stop. So it's a different culture and there's a different expectation. This happens to me all the time. I just basically gave up on trying conclusions because I just get yelled at. As far as things that a lot of non-Destreza fencers don't always know what to do with, is that a lot of our attacks are not coming from direct. We're not attacking across the diameter. We're attacking from angles, and when your strategy is focused on find, gain, lunge, kill, and the person is not in front of you, this bothers people. And so one of the pieces of advice I give to students who are like, I don't know what to do when you're walking around me like this, my answer to them is first, try to keep me in front of you. Because as long as I'm in front of you, I'm not attacking you from these weird angles. And you're more in your comfort zone. And so conversely, when I'm trying to hit them in a tournament, then my strategy is to not let them stand in front of me, or not to get out from in front of them, so that I can attack them where they have to pivot themselves or where they have to move in response to what I'm doing. This establishes my control over the pacing of the match. So I try to keep them in responding to me at all times.
So you find essentially you find the circling footwork most useful, Jim.
Yes.
I'm overgeneralizing. That's my job. But is that where you're going with that in terms of how you're doing that, or?
Mostly, yes. I'm also I'm a very aggressive Destreza fencer. I'm not necessarily moving fast, but a Myers I know is like, dude, do you ever fight from the vor? I'm like, I don't think I do. Maybe I should practice that.
I just want to say something. There are a couple of HEMA tournaments that are starting to allow blade grappling, but only for a split second. So as soon as you grab the blade, you have to kill them or show a threat within that tempo. So that means if I were to grab a blade, I have to do something immediately that will wound my opponent. If I struggle, so if there's some sort of struggling that happens there, then it is voided and I've lost my hand from cutting myself. But yes. Let's move on to the next question.
Yeah, I've seen a couple comments from Joseph about shunt locking and sweeping. I'm not really sure what those terms mean, so I'm having a hard time figuring out how to answer. Oh, just kind of like.
I think unmute yourself and explain briefly, Joe, and then mute yourself again. This will be the one exception that we allow this, because coming from a panelist question.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, so what I mean by a shunt would be, say in kendo, we would be here, we would get in close, and we would lock swords close in a pushing match. That's shunting. And then what we would do for sweeping is, say somebody came in to attack a head strike, we might divert, stick out our foot. As they're falling, we would strike men, do, or kote. So I was wondering, in your tournaments, do you guys do any of that sort of stuff? I'll mute myself.
Thank you, Joe.
You generally don't see it with a single-handed sword, like a single-handed point-oriented sword like the side swords or the rapiers that we're using. Mostly because it's just easier to stab someone. And plus, like when we're fighting out there, we generally we're holding our arm extension. If someone is applying pressure to me, it's a lot easier for me to yield that, and then throw a movement of conclusion, or something like that, or to just essentially just not be there, and rely on the different method of using this kind of straight, pointy sword that I'm fighting with extended, rather than trying to just assert my my force forward from my shoulders down my arms. But what Ken just said, sense the pressure and just kind of be like, I don't want to be there.
Yeah, to address things from somebody who's done EI, I know what you're talking about. I know what you mean. So first of all, there are two answers to your question. One of them is historical technique and physics, which Jim has covered, and the other is HEMA rule sets, HEMA tournament rule sets. There are as many HEMA tournament rule sets as there are grains of sand in the world, and depending on which tournament you go to, they may allow it. Some of them allow it in an intelligent way, like they have mats and they've got people who are trained to deal with grappling. Some tournaments don't do it well, and there are horror stories that come out of that. But if we're talking about the Destreza, which is based on the sword alone with a single hand, the leverages are completely different. The reason that you use a side sword or a rapier is because you can keep your opponent further away from you, while still manipulating this weapon with the kind of fulcrum action that you get with two hands is The moment you add this second hand and the way it connects to the body and the way that your body pushes off the floor is very different from what happens with a single hand. Now, the principles are the same. You're still using your whole body to enact pressure from the floor, and you're moving energy back and forth. But the way that it happens is there's one fewer anchor point, so all the motions are different. If you were to get in close like that with a single rapier, you'd be punching the dude.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know.
And
But,
we don't want to do that.
Well, I mean,
we might, but that way lies
fighting.
concussions.
Yeah,
I don't want to concuss somebody with my hilt. That's what I don't want to do.
Yeah. So you might want to look into some longsword tournaments because the longsword does have some, Venn diagram crossover principles wise.
Yeah. We're still not generally like sweeping the leg. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, no, trips and stuff.
We're still not generally leg sweeping. I know Thibault has my favorite plate, which is the kick to the chest. That's not allowed either. Turns out they yell at you.
Talk before we move on to the next question that somebody asked. Puck, you said that you had some answers for questions about landing your LVD attack. So I'll let you address that, then we'll ask another question after that.
Yeah, somebody in the chat had said that they have trouble getting referees to see their attacks. And as the tradition in modern times has evolved, it was at first really upright, really static, and we started to get better and more fluid. And then we get into Maestro Tom Pue's sort of flowing Destreza style. And what we see with that is a new emphasis on appropriato as one of the 3 timing considerations. And I'm going to break that down into plain English, but if you understand Fabris wants to get people into obedience. So we show some kind of threat, like the right angle, and we do that under certain contexts, and then it gets the adversary to move. And once we get the adversary moving, we control their tempo, and we can place strikes. So now, like Destreza before was very much about to take the blade and go. And now we're much more about take the tempo and go. So we're going to look at getting adversaries into obedience, getting those arms moving. And once the adversary is responding to the threats that we're creating, the final assault that we deliver is going to be much more obvious to a referee. The play is going to be much more fluid and much more advanced. And I think that's all where we want to go. But I'd like to hear other people's thoughts on that.
Oh, I would love to jump in on that. Because first of all, I think you're 100% correct. But I also want to just take a second to be like, hey, actually, it is really tough to get referees to see what we're doing sometimes. I think that a lot of times, and I'm sure all the Destreza people can account for this, but all of my Thibault students have this problem too. Well, they'll go into a tournament and some ref will just be like, what are you doing? Like, because tournaments are under this context, and the context is Italian fencing, and it's really hard to get a referee who's only seen Italian fencing their entire life to all of a sudden be like, why are you moving in a circle? Why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? I don't understand. Why aren't your knees bent, right? So it's really difficult, and it's one of those things that I've struggled with my entire career, so I absolutely sympathize with it. But I think Puck is absolutely correct, is that we definitely have to think in terms of taking the tempo. And Thibault, and many of you probably will agree with me on this, is a counterpuncher. He's a counterattacker. He doesn't do this parry thing. He's really looking for you to commit yourself to some tempo during one of his pauses, and he's just gonna put the point in your face. As soon as you take that tempo, he's just gonna counterpunch you. If you try to take a tempo to cavazione under and try to hit him, guess what? He's already on that direct line. He's already stepped 45 degrees in one way, and the point's in your face now. Which I think is like really the way that it needs to happen. Unfortunately, stepping 45 degrees with a 2 ref system or like a 3 judge system or whatever HEMA is using, or what I think SCA is mostly self-call, but I'm not familiar with it.
Yes.
It's like yeah, you're just, there's some things that aren't going to be seen by a HEMA ref, just for the nature of that's not what they're looking for, that's not what they're used to, and to thinking that they're going to get used to it in the course of like a bout or like a pool, it's just not going to happen. So I sympathize, but I think Puck is correct.
Yeah. You can also think about where you're targeting, and and set your strategy accordingly. So like, I like to, when I'm fighting HEMA people, particularly weirdly in the Midwestern United States, our primary tradition is that we see in HEMA tournaments is German, lots of Meyer people. And so I like to stab them in the back of the forearm. Everyone can see that because the sword is coming toward you. I'm like, okay, there it is. And so now there's this beautiful bend in my rapier. And they're like, oh yeah, that clearly, got hit in the arm, or, hitting someone in the head. Everyone can see when you cut someone in the face. And so, you can you can manipulate your opponent accordingly by controlling those tempos, so that when you do land shots on them, you're landing shots in places that either make noise when you land a cut, and let's face it, like a lot of judges will hear a noise and they'll raise their arm, or that are really easy to see when you've stabbed someone because it's not covered by their own body. Where I have the most problems is when you these shots that come under here, right? They come under the sword arm into the belly, which was like the perfect, oh look, a Tahoe transverse stabbed them. So the judge on the other side just may not see that. And so I can't do that as often.
Before we go back, I'm going to go back to, let's see, there was a question in here regarding, well, I'll go to mine because it was a while ago. But what do you guys do, or what do Destreza practitioners do against people that aren't doing single, that are using Dagger? And do you bring Dagger to the tournament yourself? And how do you think that impacts your results? And how do you think it is? Cite your sources. I'm just kidding. If you're using it, I want to know what book you're using it to prove it. I'm sorry. That's Lois.
Lois, you are my sources. So wait, I don't know what I'm going to do.
No. I just transmit them in English. I am not a source.
This is not fair. I have like a whole book.
What do you do against practitioners in tournaments that are using something other than single? So you're going against somebody with Dagger. You're going against somebody with a different set. And you do when you use Dagger yourself or another offhanded weapon. What do you use? So continue.
So
it's not a source. Yes.
I am not a source. So the first thing is
you.
Lois Spangler quote. Sorry. 2023. Sorry, Lois. I quoted you in my research papers. You're a source. I'm sorry.
Oh dear. So if you're quoting my translations, that's fine. Anyway, the number one thing for me was learning to trust my practice and technique with a single sword and not being freaked out by the opponent having whatever else in their hands. Now, I'm quite happy to fight with an offhand weapon. At BSIS, we do the Figueiredo array, like we do the Figueiredo stack. So we do Dagger, Buckler, Rodela, Cape, and Bracer, which is, boy howdy, that's a lot of fun. But number one, don't be intimidated. Like you have your posture, you have your angles on your side. If you've got an Italian facing you who loves to get your point with their frickin' dagger, play to their outside. Don't let their dagger engage. If you do feel like you want to bring in an offhand weapon, you have a few different Canon LVD styles to pick from with Dagger, which is pretty neat. You've got, I believe I've got Figgy's Buckler translated on my website if you want to take a look at that. Rodela is very, you sort of hold it in one place like sort of a cow catcher. And it's a great way to hold it because you bring your shoulder blade back and you bring your elbow down. He's very specific about putting your elbow down. So you're carrying the weight of the Rodela in your back and your hips. And then you just deny this whole area of attack for your opponent to get to. Doesn't matter if they have a dagger and a sword or whatever. You've now denied a whole area of space for them to really think about getting to, which means you have less to think about in terms of trying to control their weapon, trying to engage them to come in or do whatever you want them to do. I'm way biased because I'm swimming in this stuff, but the technique, the the philosophy of it will give you all the answers that you need. You just need to spend some time practicing and interpreting it how it works best for you. But you know, for Figgy's offhands, the fundamental underlying principle of all of them is you use them to slow down and interrupt and force the opponent to make bigger circles with their swords. You're forcing them to work around it, whether you're using cape. Bracer's a tiny bit different, but it's still there. Buckler's the same thing. Rodela's the same thing, and dagger is the same thing. With your actions, you are forcing your opponent to have to make bigger circles, which gives you more time to get things done. So if you sort of pare stuff down, instead of worrying about what technique can I do, it's like, what's the principle underneath it, and how can I work that principle into how I do things?
Another thing to think about, particularly because we're talking about competition, is what do the rules allow your partner to do? I have seen exactly 0 HEMA or SCA tournaments, for example, that allow punching with the rodella. It's just not safe. You can't do it. I just don't believe you can do it. And so far, it seems like most organizers agree. And so if someone's got a big shield, guess what they're not going to do? They're not going to punch you with it. You know, if you have a cape or a big cloak in the SCA tournaments, you know, you can't create a tripping hazard with them. So I'm not going to like, or blinding hazard, I'm not going to like throw it over my opponent's face, or not going to, you know, throw it on the ground and try to trip them. There are limits to what they can do. And generally speaking, unless it is a dagger or another sword, they're not going to hit you with it. And so if they're not hitting you with it, you're really mostly concerned about attacking them on angles where their body, I'm going to assume, I'm right-handed, and I'm going to assume most people are too, where their body is interfering with their ability to engage that other weapon. Because if someone's right-handed and you're outside their right arm, it's a lot harder to reach you with their left hand, regardless of what it is, whether it's a dagger, right? Whether it's a buckler. There are now limits based on their own the human physical structure that you can't, you know, that limits their ability to use that secondary weapon. And yes, a giant Keon is a great way to think about it. Like, I love Figgy's cloak because it's just like, this is a Keon extender, and it just devours swords. Like, we have a guy, you know, people like to cut, you know, if someone likes to cut the leg, it's just like, and your sword is there now, goodbye.
I just want to jump in on these secondaries as well. So you're facing down a secondary with a single sword, and Pacheco talks about this specifically when he talks about counters to the vulgars. And again, he does this thing where he puts out a threat and he draws committed motion, a dispositive movement from the adversary, and then he just works against it. So this answer of getting the adversary into obedience, getting them to move defensively and then working around it is exactly what he would recommend. And when he says go against the dagger, he basically characterizes the dagger as something like a circular windshield wiper, right? It's going to make one circle or it's going to make the other to clean up. And so you just put your sword out there, show them the right angle. And when you trigger their motion, you just make a circle in whichever direction they're going, and then you walk in the thrust. I mean, that works great. Most people can't think much deeper than that. Then you just have to be mindful that the counter-punching SCA fencer that you're working with, you handle whatever it is that they're going to throw at you with the other hand, and you should be good.
Yeah, I've heard repeatedly, mostly from Terry, and I don't remember who he's quoting, but the dagger's easy to deceive, right? If we talked about this earlier, where your hand is the origin of your sword motion. I can make very small motions with my hand that require very large motions with someone's dagger arm to respond to as you move to different lines. And so specifically, if you're fighting someone who's using a sword and a dagger, and you don't want to just sort of screen off their dagger with their body, you want to roll to that side, you just deceive you deceive the dagger. It's, you know, your fingers and wrist are going to move faster than their elbow and shoulder. It just is going to happen.
Sorry, go ahead, Lois, please. And then we'll move on to another question, but continue, please.
I just want to jump in because I feel like
Collin. Okay, I didn't know that was Lois.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Oh, no, please, go ahead.
I just want to jump in here because and maybe I'm misinterpreting, or maybe I'm hearing this wrong, but it seems like everybody's kind of saying, oh, this is like an easy thing to do. Correct me if I'm
It's a
wrong.
practice.
This is literally the hardest thing to do. Like I don't want to sugarcoat this for my students especially who have been like struggling this with their last like 2 or 3 tournaments. This is literally the hardest thing to do. It's not like I can just, the philosophy is there. I 100% agree with you. But this is not easy, especially against a fighter that knows how to provoke, a fighter that knows how to think to second intention. Like this is it is not easy to go against a 2 weaponed opponent with just your sword. And yeah, Thibaut has like beautiful philosophy on this of just like you deal with whatever they're putting out in front. You move to the side, you move to the side away from the threat. You deceive the dagger. Yeah, of course. But it's another layer that you, as the single swords person, need to think about, right? So to me, this is still like the absolute hardest thing. And it's definitely the thing that I personally struggle with the most is going into a tournament and saying like, well, I've got like another thing and I've got another thing if I want it, but I don't have to. Also, to be clear, some HEMA tournaments will literally require you to hold the other thing in your hand, even if you're not using it, which stinks, but is just like a thing that just seems to happen. It's really hard. You need to practice it. It is not. It's just the philosophy is there, but it's not easy.
So one thing that I have my students try to do is just go out there with a single sword and have another fencer with a sword and dagger bind the sword down and rush him with a dagger because that's what like I don't know, like most people who go out there with a sword and dagger and you go out there with a sword alone, when they see that, that's what they're going to do. They're going to engage your sword and they're going to run you down and they're going to knife you repeatedly until until the judge sees it or until you
Yeah.
call it. And so if you think about that, like in order to do that, they have to change which shoulder is forward, right? And that means they have to move around their own body or move through their own diameter. These are actions that you can respond to, and these are actions that you can exploit. You just need to practice them, and you need to practice them against people who are doing it faster and faster and faster.
So what I'd really like to do is carry on from Collin's commentary, because I am worried that I did come off as saying, it's easy, you just do this. It's not. What I've found in terms of practical advice for making this stuff happen for me is when I'm dealing, when I'm sparring or when I'm in a tournament, I rely on, and forgive me if it sounds kind of fruity, but I rely on mindfulness techniques to keep me in the present. I don't want to be thinking ahead. I don't want to be thinking about what just happened. I need to be thinking about what is happening right now, because that is what I'm responding to. If I can make small predictive, small gentle predictive intuitions, but I don't want to get locked into them, because if I
Now,
get locked
Lois,
into them,
on that question, because I'd like to hear you expound on that. Those are great general tournament headspace. That's perfect. Do you do anything specific for Destreza with those in terms of that? Just out of curiosity, because that's great.
yes, because so if we build off of the idea of and Roberto mentioned this, atajo can also mean to trap. So if we build off the idea, there are 3 fundamental building blocks that all sorts of other stuff come up from, but there are 3 fundamental building blocks in my mind for Destreza. One is keep yourself moving and use the curve to keep yourself moving around your opponent, seeking good angles. When when you're moving, you either have that right angle ready to go to sort of protect you, or you're seeking to put an atajo. Or if you've got somebody who's withdrawn, you're taking actions, you're taking intentional actions, not just like, what if I do this? Is he going to react? No, you have to take intentional actions at a useful target to get them to do something, which is acometimientos beginning to poke its head out again. But anyway, what I'm trying to do is rely on the practice that I've done with drilling, all right, so I get this kind of pressure on my blade. I know that I have one of two options. I get this kind of pressure on my blade. I know that I only have one option to get out of there safely or to do something with it. If I've got a point of contact, there's maybe one or two things I can do. By learning, I don't like to use the word trigger, but by learning cues, impetus, by learning feel.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's even beyond that. Like it can be an absence of feel, it can be a presence of the blade in some portion of the space between the two of you. There are always going to be sort of a descending list of options that are going to be worthwhile. And so through mental discipline, like I got ADHD. You want to talk about, trimming a frickin' decision tree? Executive function ahoy. Through drilling, through purposeful practice with an opponent, with a friendly but uncooperative opponent, which would be like slow sparring, you start to teach your body what certain pressures mean along certain parts of your blade and how you can respond to that, and what how certain stances are probably going to unwind, and then you can stop being like, that guy's doing that, I totally want to try blah blah blah. By the time you've gone through that thought process, something has happened. So instead, you want to be in the fight. It's very much like EI. It's very much that that Mushin kind of concept. You just want to be responding to what the opponent is doing without ascribing, deep intentions, anything like that. Anyway, I'm talking a lot. Go on.
Puck, you said that you wanted to pick up on Lois's train of thought.
Yeah, I do. So I want to lay out the idea of a couple of different types of training, right? So there's the type of training where what you're doing is you're trying to bring the tradition inside yourself, right? So, and that can take a lot of different forms, but what I want to do is I want to take that tradition and put it into my own body and build my own paths of excellence. And then there's the type of training which is oppositional, where you take a counter tradition or an adversary, and then you build a model of that opponent and you train against that. And that's a really different kind of thing. You try to identify the adversary's paths of excellence. You construct a model of that tradition or adversary, and then you train hard against that so that you have, you deny them their path of excellence and feed them into your own. These are two really different things. And I think that's an important concept. So I've done both. I think both have a place. So fighting against John O'Mara, we did that. Fighting against Ton. I think a lot of people, and we've done that against the Italian tradition at large. And if you look at the Destreza texts, the way they break down vulgar tretas, the way they look at other traditions, it's essential to what we do.
All
I
right.
think I can.
So, yes, and okay, Jim, did you say you wanted to say something next?
Yeah. So, Ibel had a great question. Like, it's hard to train against these types of things in practice because everyone's like, I'm gonna match you for this. I have two pieces of advice. One is for students in a sort of.
In case people missed the question, I just want to reframe it because Ibel asked what happened in the SCA. Often when they are fencing, they want to fence single, and the other person goes, "Okay, well I'll match you." Like, no, bring you. I want to bring me, you bring you. So that's the question that I believe that Jim was answering. So continue.
Right. And so the answer is like, if someone's doing this in a competitive setting, that's a little different. When you are in practice, and I think what makes SCA practices somewhat different from the HEMA clubs that I have encountered is our practices can have just say a diversity of approaches to fencing. We're not all doing the same thing, particularly the Destreza. And so what as I suggest as a student is when you are going to practice something, walk up to someone and say, I want to work on this. So like I want you to bind my rapier and stab me with your dagger, whatever that is. Get people to actually give you the thing that you want to train. If you are the instructor, if you're sort of one of the more senior people that people look up to and are sort of accountable for helping them succeed. One of the things I always do when I'm fencing when I'm fencing with someone is, outside of a tournament where the only goal is to poke them before they poke you, is what do you want from me? What are we working on? Right? And that might just be, I just want to fight. And that's cool. That's fine. And it might be, hey, I'm having this big problem fighting against sword and dagger people because I just don't get to do it a lot. I'm like, okay, great. Now I know that. Now I can give you what you want. And when you have a scenario where it is more kind of study group like, where you don't have an instructor and their students, then as the sort of mentor type person in that relationship, it's incumbent on us to make our students comfortable asking for that.
All right. Collin, you wanted to say something real quick?
Oh no, I know we had to move on, so I just typed it in the chat. We're cool. We're cool to go.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm comfortable sticking with the style, with the conversation as necessary and letting it take its natural flow. I'm not trying to force any questions or any pace on this at all. So these are great questions. Somebody asked something a while ago, and it's not that I'm going back to it, but it's on my list. So I guess I am going to force a question here. Somebody said, based on the conversation I think Collin was saying before and about some of the tournament questions, somebody asked, are you at a disadvantage using Destreza in a tournament? And this relates to my question that Phil and I had talked about ahead of time, but in a much kinder way, is what are the advantages and disadvantages of using Destreza in a tournament? So it asks their question is, are you at a disadvantage? What are the disadvantages? And what are the advantages as well? So I'm going to try to put as positive a spin on this. Okay, Colin's laughing there, so I'm assuming that they might have an answer here too. So.
I don't even need to see who asked the question, but I'm like 90% sure it was Mariano Lopez. Yes, we are at a disadvantage. We are absolutely at a disadvantage. And I hate to say it this way.
What's the disadvantage? What is it?
So I hate to say it this way, but it's all about framework. And I'm probably going to out myself a little bit here. But like when you're in a society of creative anachronism or of European martial arts, or just a general society, if your society is built around a particular framework and you come in doing something completely different, guess what? You're at a disadvantage. And it's just going to be like that across the board. If you come into a scene that has been from the 90s, focused on an Italian school of fencing, whether it's like general Italian or it's Fabra specifically or it's Capoferro specifically, and you come into it and you're doing and you don't bend your knee at all, and you're circling around and you're doing upright, right angle or posture the straight line, whatever you want to call it, you're going to be at a disadvantage. And that's just kind of an understanding we all have.
I'm going to interrupt. Damn it. I'm trying to shut up as a moderator here. But okay. Oh, never mind. I'm a moderator. So yeah, that's interesting. At a disadvantage.
It's also, but the same
conditions. I have differing opinions, and I think that there is a period in time where you are actually at an advantage when people don't know how to deal with you because you're a novelty. Once they learn how to deal with that novelty, because I went through that novelty phase where you confuse the heck out of people in tournaments and they don't know. They're like, why is somebody standing up and why is somebody circling me? And they get confused. Then they learn how to fight you. And then you're at a complete disadvantage and now you have to grow. But okay, so Collin?
I'm sorry. I 100% agree with you. But the context that we fence in is completely different, and that's the only difference. So the context that you fence
in, please.
The context that you primarily fence in is SCA, if I'm correct.
Correct. Yeah.
So it's primarily self-called.
Mm-hmm. I got hit.
I primarily fence in a refereed match.
Thank you.
All of the referees are looking for Italian movements. They're looking for they're looking for provocations and invocation. Provocations and invitations. They're looking for all of those things, and they're not looking for it in a straight line. I'm going to tell a really brief anecdote, and it's gonna drive everybody in this panel wild. And I apologize for it in advance. I also apologize to the referee who unfortunately was the source of this. I went to a tournament. And I kept doing offline actions and nailing my thrusts, like absolutely nailing my thrusts. And I was doing single sword versus sword and dagger, and I was just having the best day of my life. And the referee did not see a single one of them. And at one point, they said to me out loud, "Well, stop doing things offline because I can't see them."
Mm-hmm.
And I proceeded to just quit the rest of the pool because at that point, what am I
Yeah,
supposed to do, right?
That is
Um,
unique and special.
yeah, and
That's
like to be fair,
that's a bad ref.
I love that referee. That referee is one of the people in HEMA that I adore the most. But that's just the framework that has been built, and that's just what the referees are operating under. So I
I had
completely understand though. I completely understand though how in SCA this could be completely different
That's interesting.
Well,
because of the
the
lack of
funny thing
referees.
is, in the SCA, when I went for my free scholars prize, maybe two people there understood what the hell I was doing. And when I was practicing sword and dagger as one of my forms, bless him, he meant well. The judge turned to me and said, "Can you please do a dagger forward thing? I just want to see that dagger come forward."
It's like, no.
I got two things
Here.
to say.
Yeah.
When I was competing at first, I felt like I had to do more work just because I'm seeking binds, I'm seeking atajos. My arm is getting tired because I'm trying to overpower people or give in to people, and fighting in binds is just more tiresome, period, that I think for me at least, than just, throwing a thrust. Or I can do 1,000 lunges. But if I bind you for 5 minutes, I'm gonna be more tired than 1,000.
So, so then here's a
Thanks, Phil. Do some more planks.
It's true. So I just feel like I had to do more work to get a point rather than someone just being really fast and lunging. And if someone could get a point in one tempo, it takes me two goddamn tempos, 10 Ps, just to get a point. If I'm trying to follow my sources and like do what I'm supposed to do.
So as time's gone on, then in the HEMA world, have judges started learning what you're doing out there and how it differs, or is it still the same way it is now as it was a few years
It,
ago, and they're just not changing? I know it's a disadvantage, but I'm just curious as to whether it's changed over time. And the second part is do you have any advantages
yeah.
of
So
doing it?
I spent a lot of 2022 fighting HEMA tournaments just because the SCA schedule had basically completely fallen apart and everyone was trying to figure out how to find their sites again and how to just get everything back into a calendar. And so like, I think I've noticed that at least again in the Midwestern United States, there seems to be there's more more people are self-calling. You drill someone, they're going to go, oh yeah, that was good. And that's great. I love it. I am a big fan of self-calling. For this reason. I also do think that the refs are starting to pay more attention. Um, again, Midwestern United States, there's more of a German tradition. And so even when you have a rapier tournament, you've got a bunch of Meyerists with these dinky little 38 inches in swords who are winding all over the place. And so a lot of the same visibility challenges apply. And so, just the judges are getting better because they're learning to, they're starting to look for more things, look and see more things as the sort of slate of what people are studying from continues to grow. This is not and this is not unique to our system at all. I've known people who fight your very, kind of your generic dagger forward, sword down here. And I've watched this guy every single time. He just was he would seed back, stab him in the nose, seed back, stab him in the nose. He did this like 6 times. None of them were called because they didn't notice it, but they notice it now because they realized, oh no, this guy keeps stabbing someone in the face. He's just not concussing his opponent because he's not being a jerk to them. And so yeah, you do have to kind of if your judges aren't educating themselves, you do kind of want to talk to them and start trying to show them what you're doing. Sort of events that are not non-tournament events are great for that. And yes, Dan's point, the holding a thrust for 3 count, I've done that a couple of times where it's just like, and they'll just wait for it, and eventually someone's going to notice it.
So along this line, in terms of, does the style require being adapted in tournament? And do you lose what is really the style when you make those adaptations, or are you adapting it to maintain it within the style and the philosophy? So do you have to adapt it for tournaments?
Nope.
Not really.
Okay, I love yes, no questions. There we go. Next question.
Other than the fact that I'm not actually murdering somebody, right? Like, yes, if you're actually stabbing someone off in a Tahoe under here, and on your way out, everything is going to come out, and there's a bunch of stuff, that you're going to do with the sword because it's inside of someone. We don't have to worry about that.
Well, how do you adapt it then for those disadvantages where the refs, how are you overcoming those difficulties that you're encountering out there that are your disadvantages? How are you overcoming them? Otherwise, people wouldn't be getting gold and silver and placing so well. So obviously everybody here is who's on this panel has done success in various tournaments. So I'm curious as to how you're adapting the style in tournaments to be a success. Are you just
I use parry riposte, right? Yeah. So if they attack, right, the low guard fences I fence in tournaments, they're not totally suicidal. So like their first intent still might be to like my high inside, right? Because they do want to protect themselves on some level. So if you can just bait or invite a deep committed attack, right? You put a Tahoe on your sword, and then you can attack with control, and then you can hold it for as long as you need to, right? Because their sword isn't going to free up. So it's not just parry riposte more instead of trying to. I know in the text it says like you put a Tahoe on your sword, then you step to Medio Proporcional, and then you go to them. But they don't have a sword for you to a Tahoe, so just wait for them to come to you, parry, and then just riposte.
So do you think you have to be twice as good as your opponent to overcome those disadvantages in HEMA, and train twice as hard as everybody else because you're a Diestro and you need to be better than everybody? I mean,
I don't think so. I mean, if you want to talk about specific adjustments I make to the way that I move myself versus what might be sort of like following the lines and chords on on the imaginative diagram, I use a longer sword when I'm fighting most rapier. In a rapier tournament, I'm going to use a 45-inch rapier, and because that lets me do the second thing, which is I widen my angles a little bit. Like when I'm taking transverse steps, I will take, I will step a little wider than normal so that when my thrust comes in, they can see the giant ass rapier embedding its, sticking under someone's ribs, or sticking in, it's like sticking in the cuff of their elbow. I'm trying to stay away from situations where it's hard to see, or in the SE context where I might have to would grab someone, or use something that's against the rules. And so what I typically will do is I will try to just divert more to the point. Like I will, instead of making doing this technique where I would make a cut, I'll make it a little wider of a step so that I can turn it into a thrust. Right? Everyone sees, oh, you stabbed that guy in the face. Like no one misses that. Everyone knows what that is. And I haven't really had to adapt anything. The reason I went to Destreza in the first place was adapting. Both of my knees have been reconstructed, and they're not getting any younger, and so I really cannot lunge, not for very long. What I can do, however, is run around like this, and let people smack their heads into my sword. I just need to make a few adjustments to make it easier. And yes, Pacheco would insult the hell out of me, but also I'm alive and he's not.
So I want to jump in on this a little bit. So people are asking questions like, does that mean you have to be twice as good, or you have to be really good to do this? or is the learning curve harder? And yes and no. Like the thing that I hit people with the most is draw them to me, put my sword on top of theirs, and then hit them in the face. This is not complicated, right? But I am a tiny little man fencing gorillas who are 8 feet tall with 45-inch swords, and I'm bringing out a sword that's typically 37. So what are the things that I need to do to make that work? I need to really develop my own path of excellence. I need to use footwork traps to get those people to come to me, and I need to get them to stick that arm out, right? So I show them what they want. I show them a little bit of seductive ankle, and my ankles are very good looking at this point. And I get them to give me that attack, and then 1, 2, bam, bam. There's nothing simpler than just covering their sword with yours and cracking them in the face. That being said, if you want to be able to do entering techniques, then you need to go to the other side. You go to acometamientos and things like that. So I would say when you're going to do this, you need to develop your own path of excellence, right? You need to be good at some fundamental actions at a really high level. When you're going to walk into a situation, don't walk in with a weapon disadvantage. So when I'm going to fence somebody like John or Tong, I take a look at the weapon that they're carrying and I'll match something that's close in speed and balance to what they have so that I'm not carrying a huge disadvantage. And if I have the option to sandbag them a little bit, so just before I fenced John, Destreza versus Italian, he wanted to have a kind of a warm-up match. So I took a 35 up against him and I just let him steamroll me. And then the night of the tournament, I brought out a weapon that was about 4 inches longer than that. He wasn't ready for it. So there are a lot of different ways when you're getting ready to get into a competitive situation where you want to level set, right? Build your path of excellence, deny the path of excellence in your adversary, and don't walk in with a weapon disadvantage. Know the game that you're going to play, know the person that you're going to play it against, and then I'm going to use modest profanity. It's quit your bitching and apply your tradition. And I'm going to reframe that as quit your complaining and start your training. That's how you do well in tournaments.
Yeah, and to answer Mariana, like for me, I mean, it's going to be different for everyone, but for me, it's because if I did not switch to something like Destreza, I would not be able to continue fencing.
Actually,
I
I
did
just
not have a
want to.
choice.
Can I give a shout out real quick? I also moved to a Destreza tradition because I tore my ACL and literally could not bend my knee. So like,
Oh,
Jim, you and me, we're on the same wavelength, buddy.
we're,
Like,
we're we're here now. Yeah, no, like the SCA doesn't allow kicking is someone threw a Muay Thai kick that they don't even allow in MMA tournaments and just
Oh,
tore out my right, just broke my right
so
knee. I'm like,
that's
thanks, dude.
I got flipped the wrong way over somebody's knee at Surfo and blew out my ACL in the longsword competition.
Okay, this actually brings me to one of my questions on my list.
Yeah.
I
But
don't think of
before
it
you
as
go
it
there,
relates to Muay Thai Thai kicks, but do you think that there's any injury concerns with Destreza and tournaments that other styles don't have to deal with?
I have hit people in the back of the head when they weren't wearing a plate, and I feel terrible every single time.
That's a good one, actually. Yeah, I have that one too.
do you guys have shoulder or elbow injuries, like fencer's elbow?
yeah, tennis elbow.
Mm-hmm.
So I was talking with
Rotator cuff can be an issue.
I'm
Yeah.
in shoulder rehab right now. I was talking with Maestro Pui, and he was saying so both Maestro Alberto Bompresi of AIA, Maestro Tom Pui of AGIA, and myself, we're all dealing with shoulder rehab right now. So
Me too.
yeah, so if
Same.
you're going to do this tradition, then you want to develop a diversity of shoulder exercises. Don't let your shoulders rock forward, and use lower trap exercises to help get those back. Exercise in the lower trapezoids.
Actually, I have a
As somebody who,
fantastic one for this.
as somebody who
Indian
competed
clubs.
and actually dealt with, they almost wanted me to do surgery for it as well. Biceps tendonitis in my upper shoulder, and a fluid in there. And they actually, and it was because I practiced alone and nobody was able to tell me, don't hunch your shoulders because you're a tall guy. So then I had to retrain myself to keep my shoulders back. And fence much more upright, and it looks a lot more period, but I still get lazy if I don't do it in a while. So that's again the shoulder. Is that the same type of shoulder? What type of shoulder injuries are people having? Just out of
So,
curiosity.
mine are
Collin?
rotator cuff related.
Rotator.
So
Okay.
what I'm working on, and this is a bad habit of mine from Taekwondo, is that I can extend my arm here, or I can extend it here.
Yep.
This is fine when you're punching someone. This is not fine when you're holding a kilogram weight and flinging it forwards.
I got a lighter sword myself. I was carrying a very heavy two pounder, and I went to a pound and a half.
My trainer has been working on, who's also a HEMA practitioner, it's great, is plugging that shoulder in, engaging this lat down here, and now this is what holds my sword. Like Lois, you were saying, you're hanging your secondaries. You're also hanging the sword. It's a little harder when it's out there, but that engages these big muscles on your back that are made for carrying things, and you're not trying to support the weight of this sword on the small muscles up here that are really more for steering.
Yeah, I talk about posture and stance a lot when I'm training people at BSIS, because if you can, and it's the kind of stuff that you can practice when you're standing waiting for a bus or you're watching a commercial on TV or whatever. Because if you can get that written into your body, you're going to eliminate a huge vector of potential injury later on.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm actually going to be the one person on the panel that doesn't have shoulder injuries. And it's because, weirdly enough, I was a college baseball player. And what they drilled into us starting in high school and all the way through college was the thrower's 10. So if you are a Destreza practitioner and you are not currently doing the thrower's 10, please start immediately. Also, if you are using a sword...
I'm sorry. Yeah, I wonder.
Can you send us a link? What is it?
Yes, absolutely. It's a set of exercises that all baseball players should be doing, but mostly pitchers do it. But it's like it's a set of 10 exercises. I'll put a link in the Facebook group or the chat if I can find it real quick.
It took me a while to realize, because I actually had the problem with my right shoulder. So of course I go to several orthopedics, get a couple of injections, and okay, I'll take 6 months off. So I started fighting in a sling with my right hand. So I started fencing left-handed, which sounds really ideal until about 6 months of fencing left-handed. I started developing the same problem in my left because I didn't fix the source problem, which was shoulders back. And that posture thing really changed my entire fencing style. So this, like Lois, who trains people, is the sooner you do it, the better.
Yeah, and Chris was mentioning in the chat Indian clubs, and I vouch for those too. Indian clubs, if you follow like the late 19th century manuals that are out there, they will absolutely strengthen those lats. They'll strengthen all that posture chain, and they'll open up your shoulders. Like you'll actually get this stuff moving. So that's another option.
There's also a reason why the montante is the weapon of the fencing master. It's considered a weapon used to train general health. And the variety of actions you get in your shoulders from the montante forms are really useful.
One year, Puck and Eric came to the Chicago area and did an Iberian weekend. And the first day was rapiers, and the second day was montantes. It was great, except I drive a manual shift car at the time.
Oh no.
Yeah, just trying to move your arms at the end of that was just awful. Like no one could move.
You could always change gears with your feet.
Now, related to injuries, we talked about injuries briefly. Going back to what Puck had mentioned a moment ago, do you think body type affects the application of Destreza in tournaments? Do you think it actually plays a role?
Yep. So I have students. So I am about a little under 2 meters tall, and my arms are longer than they should be for my body. My arms are sized for someone who is about 2 meters tall. So there's about like that much extra arm there. Most of my Destreza students are much smaller than I am. And so yeah, there are things that we've had to work on based on their body type. So like one of my students, she's just not that. She's a middle-aged lady. She's not athletic, and she's quite short. And one like as an example of sort of how we've had to address this, this is the right angle. She's really short, so her right angle starts like here, and then she keeps getting stabbed under the arm because it's just right there. And I said, PJ, make your right angles this way, because that way you're still creating the correct angle that you need to create your atajos and control the blade without you necessarily like just being locked into this position because your opponent is like that much taller than you, right? And you physically can't do that.
I want to just
So
dovetail on that.
yeah,
So
sure.
if Destreza is true and it does not adapt to the inputs, the causes that form the fight, including your weapon and the body of the various people, is it really true or is it just prescribed tradition? I don't think it could be both, right? It needs to be able to adapt if it's going to be true.
Yeah. So I certainly don't mind, like, as long as I'm adhering to the goals of the fundamental principles, I feel like I'm doing the job right. I have found, and for those of you who teach women, let me phrase it this way instead. For those of you who teach people with wider hips, it's important to note that people with wider hips, when they are standing, upright in that right angle guard, it causes undue stress in the hip, the knee, and the ankle to stand fully profiled if
Yep.
the toe is pointing straight ahead at the opponent. So if the toe is pointing straight at the opponent, you're going to cause some serious stresses in the knee, the hip, and the ankle. If the toe tends in gently, it fixes pretty much everything. So that's a very specific thing, but I think it's important to get that out there for people who are teaching people with wider hips.
100%. Check in with your students. Ask them how a particular thing feels. And if it hurts, don't do it.
Oh man. Yes.
Yeah, like that same student, she's a dancer, and so what she has us doing is it looks like an agility drill that like soccer and football players would do, but it's just kind of getting those hips moving in ways, and it's actually improved my footwork tremendously, being better able to separate what's going on with my shoulders versus what's going on in my hips. And yes, check in with your students. Please don't hurt them. Don't chase them away.
Yeah, I cannot like back that up harder. I'm the guy in the rap. I'm the hype guy in the rap video, like 100%. And I do this with everything. Specifically like the Thibaut grip, because a lot of people will say like, oh well, the Thibaut grip, like if you don't do it right, you're not really doing Thibaut. Like, no, if it feels weird and you can't quite get it right because of the way your hand is, or because of the glove you're wearing, or because of whatever, or because of just like general thing, move how your body wants to move. And I will adapt as a teacher. I will adapt to you to still teach you the system, but you don't have to hurt yourself to do this.
So I want to add to what Collin is
Yes.
saying, because this is built into the tradition from the very first day. Carranza says that the instructor who teaches a student should be like somebody who's crafting a musical instrument. He's specifically talking about stringed instruments. And he says that you need to tighten some strings and loosen others, not so that it's in tune with the instrument next door, but in tune with itself. And only in that way will the instrument produce music and harmony. And he specifically goes on to say he did not like seeing short fencers fence like tall instructors, right? That you have to tune this tradition to the person's individuality. So when we're looking at creating students, we're not looking at creating one true form. We're looking at helping that person find the true Destreza that fits who they are, both in their body and their weapon and their spirit as well.
Yep. And your students and the people that you train with, like, you know, if you train with women, if you train with people who are, generally considered AFABs or, assigned female at birth, there's part of their anatomy that, like Pacheco would just not have thought about. Like, why would anyone care? Why would I teach a woman to use a sword? Because Pacheco's a troll and a jerk. But we're not, right? And so there are adjustments we have to make. Plus, like, depending on what people do, the rest of the time, there are things that they will or will not be able to do the same way. And so, like, you got to just work through it with them and find a way to make them comfortable in the system, like physically comfortable, so that they're not trying to fight their body or fight what you're telling them.
I want to add that there are also at least one or two really good examples of women practicing Destreza at a high level within the period. So one of the fencing masters, whose name was Agnieszko, had a daughter at his fencing school and had somebody come in to challenge the school, wanted to defeat Agnieszko. And he says, well, I've watched you fence. I know how I would defeat you, but what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to fence my daughter to see if she understands the technique. So please fence her. And she skunked him in exactly the way that Agnieszko thought that she would. So there, um, women have a place in this tradition. This is a tradition for all people.
So, does anybody have anything else to say about that before I ask another question that has come up? Okay, so the question that somebody asked was, how does Destreza deal with, or the question was, does it have a problem with with certain styles, and does it do better against certain opponents? And they're specifically talking about some of the more modern styles that are more quick draw. So we're not even talking about tournament specifics and people recognizing it, but how do Diestros deal with modern quick draw tournament techniques and technique styles that tend to,
or with a refused guard, for example, because that keeps
we just
coming
jumped right
up
into
on the
that.
chat, and yeah.
What I tell people who are mostly training in the SCA, where it is very Super Smash Brothers like, is that if I walk up to someone and try to establish my position based on where their sword is, they're going to lunge and I'm going to eat it in the face. Particularly with sort of, with your sort of back-weighted Italian fencers, right? And so what I tell people what we spend a lot of time practicing is training students to figure out not where they are, but where they could possibly reach. And the way at least I define that is with the biggest, longest lunge they can possibly muster. Because if someone can lunge and hit you, then you need to be aware that you're in danger once you've reached that distance, even if they're standing, completely straight up in the straight up and down or back weighted, whatever it is. If you're facing someone who's going to lunge, you have to account for that when you're setting yourself up. Because if I just put my sword in the classic, following the classic plate, and they're back weighted, guess what? They're going to extend their arm, lean their shoulders, and I'm going to eat one. And so, in the SCA, we tape all of our swords with contrasting colors for visibility. And so, like, the bottom of the tape is actually a pretty good shorthand for when you're dealing with a non-Diestro in terms of like where you want to start trying to set up and start engaging with their blade. Because when they shift their body weight forward to lunge, to create that lunge, that pushes their blade forward, and that actually puts them right about where a good crossing point would be in most cases that we've run into, unless you've just got ridiculously disparate height and reach. And so yeah, I tell people, don't set up where they are, set up where they can reach to. And that it changes the way you think about placing in a Tahoe. It changes a lot of things, but the main thing it does is it gives you enough space and time to adjust to the fact that there is going to be an explosive straight line attack coming right up your face.
I actually think that's really good advice. Also, some advice that was given earlier by Puck, which I think is really good advice. Using point under as a provocation, definitely something that works pretty well against these kind of more modern styles. But I really like that Thibaut like actually addresses this specifically. He has one chapter for the withdrawn guard in a weight forward stance and one for a weight back stance, which is like super, super helpful because he literally shows you, oh, okay, in this instance, what we should be doing is pointing at their hilt. And I think Puck said that earlier as well, which is super effective. And I've had a lot of success with it, actually. Not I wouldn't say like a ton of success with it, but it is successful against those style of fencers just because you kind of know what they're doing. And I kind of okay, so maybe I like sport fencing. Um,
It's fun.
I have read the book Epee 2.0, and so I call these fencers Rapier 2.0 fencers, because that's really what they're doing is they have a very particular area of excellence, and they're trying to put you into that area of excellence with either a rapier, single rapier or a rapier and dagger, and you have to know exactly like Jim said, you have to know what they are capable of, and you have to provoke them to do the thing while still remaining safe. Is it tough? Absolutely, right? But luckily, my source actually has some like two whole plates on what is effective, and it turns out that it actually is pretty effective. So if you're interested, I'll look up which exactly plates those are. I think they're like 28 and 29, but I'll put them in chat.
Wait, I have
I
a
don't.
question for you guys. So if you stand there against them and you're just in right angle, not even in weak under, and let's say you're just standing there and they're standing there, and none of you are doing anything, are you guys comfortable with that? Like,
I'm
are you
generally not
okay with that
comfortable unless
situation?
I'm moving. I'm generally not comfortable if my feet are flat. So no. Um, like if someone is standing there and they're waiting for me for me to commit to something, what that tells me is, I want to be at an angle where their sword, I want to be at an angle where they have to move in order to bring their sword back online to me. And now I'm making them react to me. Like fundamentally, who is quote unquote winning, at least the way I think about fencing, is who is dictating pacing and who is dictating the action. And if someone is always responding to what I'm doing, that gives me a lot more information about what I can do. And yeah, you're absolutely right. There are folks who are fighting kind of a more they're really good epee fighters, but they've also picked up a dagger and now they're calling it Marcelli. Um, but just understand how someone can. You look at how someone can move, you look at where they can reach, and then you set yourself up. You can set yourself up in places that are not optimal for them the way that they are standing, and now they have to change the way that they're standing in order to recreate their optimal situation. And so as long as you're the one telling them when they need to adjust, hello cat, then you're doing good.
Anyone else? I just wanted to ask everyone.
So I'm going to jump in with the Carranza quote, even though it's not necessarily the way that I work. Let's say it's the way that I would ideally work if I was a better fencer. But Carranza says that the good Destreza fencer is the one who's laying in wait. So if you think about fencing having two games, right? There's the one with the agent and the patient. The patient is the one who's waiting to form something. So even though I am most likely going to move forward and try to make something happen, if I was a better fencer, according to Carranza, I would be comfortable just waiting at defensive medio and trying to talk this person down or waiting for the assault.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
Well,
yeah,
that
we're not
goes.
de-escalating our bouts, right? Like we're here to fight.
That actually goes along with one of the questions that I still have in the last 20 minutes. It's on my list. Is how does the philosophy of Destreza, because we all know that it's big on the philosophy. Heck, the whole first book has that in its title. How does the philosophy affect its impact in tournaments and in competition? Carranza was also, wrote legal documents about dueling and various other things. So, books, not even just documents. So the question is, how does the philosophy itself impact it in the tournament and competition setting?
I feel like we can probably look at this in a lot of different ways, right? Because if you're going into a tournament with a set of goals, we need to be real clear about those goals. Those are the causes, because Destreza is a cause engine. So we put in a bunch of things, Destreza goes crunch, 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 and then we produce an output. Right? And that output can be a lot of different things depending on what we want out of it. So if I want to go into a tournament and I want to win points, that's a really different situation, right? Is it valid then? Would Carranza approve if I take those causes, I get one touch, clean, unanswered, and then I fence double touches for the next 15 touches? Did I get the outcome that I wanted? Yeah. I mean, that's one example of Destreza, right? It may not be the one that we want. What if I want to reproduce the tradition as written? But I also know that in tournaments, they would knock each other's hats off. So I include those sporting artifacts in my play. Or what if I want to recreate Destreza as if it was a martial art, right? So we can have all those different goals can exist inside one person, and they all can be equally valid. And you can interact with different people in the spectrum and get different useful things out of those. We have to be okay with all of it.
Actually, if I could ride those coattails, I think that that's like that's a brilliant summation. I would only add that I think that the philosophy of Destreza and eh, obviously and Dutch Streza, I think the philosophy is the only thing that you shouldn't adapt. Because that's the real core of it, right? So I think Puck's right is that if you're trying to score more points, that's a goal, but the philosophy remains the same. And that as long as we're sticking to the philosophy, whatever like physical adaptations we make, we're pretty much okay, I think. And maybe somebody would disagree with me, but physical adaptations are fine as long as we are sticking to the philosophy of what we're doing.
Yeah, so I 1,000,000,000% agree with Collin, because you don't have to adapt the philosophy, because it's the philosophy itself that allows you to adapt. It gives you the framework to achieve what you're seeking to achieve in a rigorous way. So philosophically, like even though it's 4 dialogues, Carranza's book, it's called Philosophy of Arms for a reason, because it's not a book about how to fence, it's a book about how to think about fencing. And if you approach it that way, and if you approach your Destreza training not only as a physical manifestation of how to operate a sword in space against an opponent, then it can become a beautiful fertile ground for you to forward the tradition while still making it yours, and it's authentic to both things at the same time, fundamentally. The philosophy is there for you. It can feel restrictive when you're first getting into it, because Aristotelian science is weird and strange, but it's the fundament, like it is the foundation of current modern scientific thinking and operation. But once you sort of get comfortable in that weird space, it's really flexible and it's really forgiving. Like, it seems like such a weird thing to say, but it's really forgiving once you just start playing around with it. And that's the thing, like, you don't have to be precious with it. You can if it's funny. Like, sometimes I do that because it's funny, but you don't have to be precious with it. And the more that you treat it like a well-respected tool, the more it's going to feed back.
I have nothing to follow that with.
I don't think anybody does, to be honest with you. That's just, I want to end, but I know we still have 15 minutes, but that was just so beautiful. Sorry, I'm just, we're all squeeing in chat about how beautiful that was, Lois. Just so you're aware.
Thank you.
I do have a question for the panel, quick question in somewhat regards to what was asked earlier. Do you guys find yourself doing better in single rapier tournaments or in rapier and dagger tournaments? Only because there's so little like out there on Destreza, rapier, and dagger. So is it harder for you that there's not much out there for you to do rapier and dagger, in comparison to single rapier?
Well,
I just don't like fencing with daggers. So yes, for me, but that's just because of who I am and the fact that I just never pick one up.
I want to
So-
toss Kaden under the bus on this one, because our Sword and Dagger is a place we needed to grow. And in order for him to take his provost exam, we just said, Kaden, here comes the bus, but boom, boom. You're going to be testing with Sword and Dagger, so you need to develop Figgy's Sword and Dagger rules at a high level. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. So at WMAW this year, we taught Kaden's provost Sword and Dagger lesson for his exam as a class. And unfortunately, he couldn't make it because he does such a better job of it. But can you talk a little bit about what it was like developing that and how you found it effective?
Uh, so the other school I go to, they like they have a heavy focus on all sorts of different types of offhands. Like they have dagger, like cane and buckler, and then cloak also. And then so I was gradually like before my provost exam, I was gradually kind of pushed in that direction to utilize the offhand. And then thankfully Lois had that translation of Figueiredo's Sword and Dagger, because without it, I don't think I could actually have developed what I have now. So basically, Figueiredo has like 4 methods, and his methods 1 through 3 is basically you use your sword to move their sword into your dagger, or rather, you force their sword into a place, and then you basically atajo with the dagger, or like Lois says, you interrupt them. So instead of, for example, like if you have atajo on the inside and you step to medio proporcional and then you disengage to the outside, in single sword you would use your sword to shut off on the outside and then stab them in the face or something. But with the dagger, you can close off inside, step to medio proporcional, and then now you can use the dagger to do it. Of course, Figueiredo doesn't really like that because he says you don't need the dagger, but I mean, we're doing sword and dagger, so you might as well just use the dagger. So you just have to think of it that way. So you use your sword to funnel their sword into your dagger. Now the problem comes is when like they're refused and then there's nothing to funnel anywhere. So that's where method 4 comes in. Is Lois can correct me if I'm wrong, but basically it's if you get parried by their dagger, right? So now they've shut down your longer weapon with their shorter. So you have a shorter weapon on their longer. So to deal with that, usually you invite, right? So you get parried by their dagger, you invite, they come in with the riposte, then you parry that with your dagger, and then you riposte with your sword with a disengagement. So you got to think about like the first 3 methods as like one thing, and then the last method as totally different. But what's interesting is that if you read Viedma's dagger section, it's more in line with Figueiredo's method 4. So I've basically combined it, not really combined because there's a distinctive split between them, but I can like switch between the two depending on how my opponent takes their guard. So if they're refused, I would use like Viedma's and Figueiredo's method 4. And then if they're sword forward, like a French or like an older Italian system, you can actually have a blade to funnel them into your dagger.
About how long, so you started putting this together and trying to exercise it against high-level opponents. About how long did it take before you felt like you were competent from square one to effective?
About a year of on and off trying different things. And even after that year, I felt very Italian using it. And I've gone to SCA tournaments and they're like, wow, your Italian sword and dagger looks really good. Like it came out of the plates. And I'm like, thanks, I guess. So it's and you can use it that way, like as like a more Italian system. But if you really think about what Figueiredo says, that you don't really need a dagger, you can start um oh sorry I don't want to get too much into the details, but basically just you can do like single sword stuff, but just holding the dagger in front of you and try to get their sword into your dagger, and then it'll look like Destreza, but with a more squared stance, if that makes sense. And your dagger is like an extra long Quion. So and
So
that you can vary, like you can stick your dagger out or pull it back as like deceptions, right? Because if you stick your dagger out, their sword will get caught on it sometimes. So if you want them to pass through a certain place, you can pull your dagger back, and then when you want to close them off again, you can stick your dagger out forward. So it's a pretty dynamic system. You guys should definitely take a look at Lois's translations and see what you can get out of that.
Yeah,
So
I'd like
practice sword and dagger more.
Figgy dagger level 1, just put your dagger there, forget about it, and it's a big Quillian.
It's like the cloak. It's a Keon extender.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't found specific. I haven't found specific sources for this. I haven't really looked very hard either. But like, also, as you're moving your arm up and down, to going for Tahos, these generals, like everyone else who talks about using a sword and dagger says something to the effect of put your dagger where your sword used to be. We can do that too. Like if I'm gonna go for Natalia, I'm gonna move my sword. I can put a dagger here. I can just leave it there, because if someone is going to disengage and fire, it's going to come up that line. And so I can either make my Keon longer to make their disengage harder, or I can anticipate where their disengage is most likely to be and just stick a piece of metal over there so that when it comes, I can just continue with my continue stabbing them. I I don't really like I don't like to do much else with the dagger. For me personally, it's because if I have it, I'm too tempted to stab people with it, and then it turns out it's not actually another second sword, and so it doesn't work out so well.
We're coming up on the last 5 minutes, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We can definitely stay later, but we might stop the recording at 10 o'clock.
I think Collin wanted to add something to that because he never got a chance to say something.
Who did? I'm sorry?
Collin.
Just real quick.
Collin, yeah. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Phil.
I'll just go real quick. I promise.
No, please.
So the question,
We're
I
here
think,
because of you. So thank you, all of the panelists. Yes, speak.
So I think that the original question was like which tournaments you end up doing better in, or like which tournaments seem to be like more easy. I have found the weirdest thing in HEMA is that if you find a side sword tournament, whether it's side sword and buckler or side sword alone, you can take LVD or Thibaut into that tournament and probably do pretty well. And it's like you would never expect it, and I still don't really fully understand why that is, but it's a thing. I've gone into side sword tournaments.
In side sword tournaments?
I'm sorry?
Don't they cut more in side sword tournaments? So everything they're doing is larger, right? So your points out there, you're basically
I think so, yeah. And
every
I
single
would
time
also
it's
say
a
that
cut.
the swords are generally shorter too. So like I think that has like a part to do with it, but it also is just I think it's also a stylistic thing, maybe.
Well, here's the thing though. Historically speaking, the kind of sword that Carranza and Pacheco were using were what we would call a side sword. A lot of the actions that they were using are born out of, like, very briefly, the Spanish vulgar style is part of a larger Mediterranean style of family of things that you see in Bolognese, Saint-Didier, and Godinho. So Destreza is operating in response to that. So yes, of course, it's going to be fantastic against side sword.
I would also even say, and if you study the Thibaut book 2 specifically, a lot of the plays against with sword against sword and rotella work super well against side sword and buckler. Just like a little hint in the chat, like if you're doing Thibaut and you go to like a side sword and buckler tournament and you want to do well, study the Thibaut plates about it because all of those plays are super effective.
This will go into our last question because it's actually, Collin, I'm glad you spoke up because that's actually been a better segue for the last question, because it pairs in perfectly with one of the questions that came from on here. It's a great way to wrap it up is what's everyone's biggest moment of pride while using their source in a tournament? That is a great wrap up. To get they want real life stories, quote unquote. And so yeah, so what is, give some real life examples in a tournament, which is the whole reason that we're here to talk about this and talking about this application for the past 2 hours. Tell some stories. What's your favorite?
I've got one real quick. So I was at an Australian tournament, and it was a saber tournament. I don't study saber. But I was just adapting. I was adapting Destreza to using my saber. So, my sword is in kind of a right angle, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, my opponent starts doing a flourish at me, and Pacheco has rules for that because what he's doing is he's behaving like a Turk. and I did exactly what he told me to do. So once my opponent's flourish came straight down like this, I chopped my cut, took out his arm. And when my sword hit his forearm protector, it went smack. The entire crowd went ooh. So there we go.
Yep.
So using the source material, coming straight down with the cut. Jim.
Absolutely.
For me, I started to get invited to other schools' prize plays to challenge their students, and that's like really cool because it's like we basically, it's like, oh, and we have a surprise for you, kind of a thing. And the feedback that I always get is just like, I don't know what you're doing, but it's really, really cool to see. And I want to know more about it. And so every time I hear that, I just kind of I just kind of have to smile a little bit. Because it's like, no, like what we're doing works. And it is also beautiful. And it is beautiful and it's fun. And when we do it right, other people can see that too, even if they were on the business end of it. And when they appreciate that, that's just like, oh.
Excellent. Next, Collin, Kaden.
All right, I got one. I was at a tournament in Raleigh, and it was a side sword and buckler tournament. I had asked them previously, do I need to actually hold the buckler to compete in this tournament? And they said, yes, you actually have to hold the buckler. You don't have to do anything with it. You have to do it. So I tried my best to hold it behind my back. I went all the way through pools that way, and it was Swiss pairs too. So it was a long set of pools. And I finally get all the way through. I go into the gold versus silver match against a very good Bolognese side sword fencer. And at one point, I actually decide that I'm just gonna pull out the buckler, parry what he's doing, and hit him in the head. And it works perfectly. And he looks at me and he goes, "Oh crap, I forgot you had that." And I was like, "Me too." It's like that's the end goal. Forget that you have anything else in your hand.
Wait, so for buckler, have you guys tried to just put the buckler on your flank, basically, and just fence single sword that way?
I just stick it right here sometimes.
Yeah, like that, yeah.
I do that with a dagger sometimes, because a lot of times in Thibaut, they'll try to go up underneath.
Yeah,
you see the dagger there, and you're just like, no.
Yeah, it's like nothing there. They go low, you just stab them in the face. So
That's Tejedo dagger right there. I included a translation for it, but look at Tejedo dagger. That's exactly what he's doing.
yeah, that's the Viedma's general buckler advice. Also, just put it on your right collateral, and you basically have no low line. So that's pretty fun to do.
Any other live tournament experiences you guys want to actually talk about in terms of
so
in action?
So I was at Cornhusker State Games, I think 2 years ago, and I was fencing this one guy who was super aggressive, and he kind of ran me down out of the ring sometimes. So I'm like, okay, I need to change it up. So what I did was I took Viedma's advice, because he also fenced sword refuse, dagger forward. So Viedma's advice against that is you walk up, or not walk up, but you feint to their face, right, with their sword high. And then when they reach out with the dagger on the high outside, you disengage under with an offline step and stab them under the dagger. And so I just did that to him a few times. And I didn't actually need to profile away because he stopped after he got hit until something triggered in his mind where he wanted the afterblow because he was getting behind in points. So then when I feint high, I go low, I hit him, and then he charges at me again, or he charges at me to get the afterblow, and then I turn away, kind of like in Cortana. It's a little bit vulgar, but oh well. We just call it gaining degrees of profile, and it's no longer vulgar. So I just turn out every single time he tried to afterblow me, and then yeah, it was just fun to do, I guess. Feint high, go low under the dagger. He charges, I just pivot out of the way, and he just went right by me every single time.
I have a good one too. So the first WMAW fight I had with Maestro Pue, our fencing was still pretty static at that point. So we went back to the drawing board, reworked our footwork. It became much more dynamic, much more flowing. Came back and fought Maestro Pue again, and landed and just did a much better job. And then I'm going to link it in the chat. But then we had Maestro Loda and Maestro Murakoshi representing the Italian tradition, and Maestro Pue and myself representing the Spanish tradition. And we beat them 2 out of 3. So like for me, it's a big moment when we can take the best of the Italian tradition and the best of the Spanish tradition, and then also me, who is not, and take it toe to toe with the Italians and be competitive. So that meant a lot to represent the tradition well, to show that we could stand toe to toe with the best that Italy had to offer.
I feel like that should be a yearly thing where we send 2 of our best against 2 of theirs.
Bill, it should come on Tuesday.
Yeah, we should do that.
You
It's
can
not
fight
me
Tim
anymore.
and Terry.
You don't send 50-year-olds out to this.
I think a number of people are logging off, but the conversation still can't continue, but we will officially wrap up the recording portion of this. And I would like to thank a few people. First of all, before we, Phil asked that and I'm very happy, is Eliette Lelever. I'm sorry, I don't speak French, I really don't. But recently just, I believe this weekend or recently just got a mod. Phil, would you like to, and is a Destreza practitioner. And they were announced earlier on during the chat way at the beginning. They recently just got their mod, Master of Defense. It is the highest level of award in the SCA, and they are a Destreza. As well. So it's actually really great to see Destreza getting recognized at the highest levels of the SCA and everything. So I just wanted to toss that out there, saying that this is, again, proof of success. I'd also like to thank all of our panelists who are here today. Collin, Jim, Lois, Kaden, Puck have always been wonderful at being able to share their knowledge and experience in the tournament and competition setting to show that this is a successful style and it can be applied successfully and can be used. So don't give up on that. And also, of course, the biggest to Phil Swift, our host, Terra Nova School of Arms or School of Swords, for hosting this and making today possible for this. And it has been a wonderful experience. Phil, would you like to say anything to wrap up?
No, just like to say thank you, everyone, especially the panelist members. We've been planning this for like a month, so thank you for all coming, and I'm glad we were able to do this. I just wanted to make some noise in the Destreza scene and get people talking about Destreza. And it's just nice to, I mean, ever since Puck did his online discussion, that just took off, and I wanted to keep it going, so.
And thank you for everybody for showed up who came here. Again, you're the reason why this is occurring, to keep this community alive and growing. And again, as Puck said, early on, is that we're doing it to grow more diestros across the world, and to spread the good word of Destreza and Carranza, spreading the good book, as I used to say, about the philosophy, and spreading it, and making sure everybody is aware that it exists and that we're real and we will stab them. On that note, we can stop the recording and the conversation can continue. And again,